Hello students, today we will look at the composition of the spinal nerves. There are a total of 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each pair of spinal nerves is connected to one segment of the spinal cord. Each pair of spinal nerves is connected to the anterolateral sulcus of the spinal cord by the anterior root. They are connected to the posterolateral sulcus of the spinal cord by the posterior root. Both the anterior and posterior roots are composed of many rootlets. Generally, the anterior root is motor in nature. The posterior root is sensory in nature. The two merge into one spinal nerve in the intervertebral foramen. Therefore, the spinal nerve contains both sensory nerve fibers and motor nerve fibers. It is of a mixed nature. Near the intervertebral foramen, the posterior root of the spinal nerve has an oval enlargement called the spinal ganglion. It contains pseudounipolar sensory neurons. Their central processes constitute the posterior root of the spinal nerve. Their peripheral processes are distributed with the spinal nerves to the receptors. The 31 pairs of spinal nerves are divided into 5 parts: 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. The first cervical nerve trunk passes between the atlas and the occipital bone and exits the vertebral canal. The 2nd to 7th cervical nerve trunks exit through the intervertebral foramina above the correspondingly numbered cervical vertebrae, whereas the 8th cervical nerve trunk exits through the intervertebral foramen below the 7th cervical vertebra. The 12 pairs of thoracic nerve trunks and 5 pairs of lumbar nerve trunks exit through the intervertebral foramina below the correspondingly numbered vertebrae. The anterior and posterior branches of the 1st to 4th sacral nerves exit through the correspondingly numbered anterior and posterior sacral foramina. The 5th sacral nerve and the coccygeal nerve exit through the sacral hiatus because the vertebral canal is longer than the spinal cord, and the height of the vertebral bodies and the thickness of the intervertebral discs vary in different parts. The direction and length of the anterior and posterior roots of the spinal nerves within the vertebral canal also differ. The cervical nerve roots are the shortest. Their course is nearly horizontal. The thoracic nerve roots are longer and run obliquely downward. The lumbar and sacral nerve roots are even longer, running almost vertically downward, forming the cauda equina. Fiber composition: spinal nerves contain 4 types of fiber components. Somatic sensory fibers from the pseudounipolar neurons in the spinal ganglion. Their central processes constitute the posterior root of the spinal nerve, entering the spinal cord. Their peripheral processes enter the spinal nerve and are distributed to the skin, skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints, transmitting superficial sensations from the skin, such as pain and temperature, and deep sensations from muscles, tendons, and joints, such as kinesthesia and position sense, to the center. Visceral sensory fibers from the pseudounipolar neurons of the spinal ganglion. Their central processes constitute the posterior root of the spinal nerve, entering the spinal cord. Their peripheral processes are distributed to the viscera, cardiovascular system, and glands, transmitting sensory impulses from these structures to the center. Somatic motor fibers arise from the anterior horn of the spinal cord, distributed to skeletal muscles, controlling their voluntary movement. Visceral motor fibers arise from the lateral horn of the thoracolumbar spinal cord, the lower center of sympathetic nerves, or the sacral parasympathetic nucleus, that is, the lower center of parasympathetic nerves, distributed to the viscera, cardiovascular system, and glands, controlling the movement of cardiac and smooth muscle, and controlling gland secretion. The posterior branch of the spinal nerve is relatively small. The anterior branch is relatively thick and large. The anterior branches of the thoracic nerves are segmental. The remaining anterior branches interweave to form plexuses, including the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus. First, let's look at the cervical plexus. Composition and location of the cervical plexus. The cervical plexus is formed by the interweaving of the anterior branches of the C1 to C4 spinal nerves. It is located deep to the upper part of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, anterior to the origins of the scalenus medius and levator scapulae muscles. Branches of the cervical plexus. The branches of the cervical plexus include superficial cutaneous branches, muscular branches distributed to deep muscles, and the phrenic nerve and communicating branches with other nerves. The cutaneous branches converge near the midpoint of the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle and emerge superficially. They distribute in a radial pattern. Their emergence point is a block point for infiltration anesthesia of the superficial structures of the neck. Another large nerve in the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. It is the most important branch of the cervical plexus. It descends anterior to the scalenus anterior muscle and then medial to it, between the subclavian artery and vein. It enters the thoracic cavity through the superior thoracic aperture. Thereafter, accompanied by the pericardiac phrenic vessels, it passes anterior to the lung root, descending between the mediastinal pleura and the pericardium, to near the central tendon of the diaphragm, where it pierces the diaphragm. The motor fibers in the phrenic nerve innervate the diaphragm. The sensory fibers are distributed to the pleura, pericardium, and part of the peritoneum below the diaphragm. It is generally believed that the sensory fibers of the right phrenic nerve also distribute to the serosa of the liver, gallbladder, and extrahepatic biliary tract. Damage to the phrenic nerve mainly manifests as paralysis of the ipsilateral hemidiaphragm. Abdominal breathing is weakened or absent. In severe cases, there may be a feeling of suffocation. Irritation of the phrenic nerve can cause hiccups. In this lesson, we studied the cervical plexus. Next class, we will begin studying the brachial plexus.